At Unregistered Academy, we are announcing right now our new slate of winter courses. Starting this week, as part of our Great Book series, we have Aristotle's Politics. Then, soon after that, we will start the history of the Cold War, and that will be followed by our next Great Books course, the Bible. Go to unregisteredacademy.com and sign up now. I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Imagine a world in which all journalists directly confront those in power and ask them face to face the most difficult questions. That is a world, my guest this week contends, of peace. This is my interview with Sam Husseini. I am joined from Riverdale, Maryland, by a journalist named Sam Husseini, who's been on the show before, not even that long ago. But what he had to say on the show then was so important, and what his work has been about has been so important to me and a lot of other people, and we all think for the future of humankind, that I had to have him back on because he's been doing amazing stuff and stuff that I have been dreaming that journalists would do for my whole life, Sam Husseini. And then I saw you do it just the other day, and you've done it before, but directly confronting the officers of the government at the highest levels. So I want to talk about that. You've gotten into the State Department press briefing room, and you confronted the spokesperson for the State Department on a couple issues, and kind of that went viral, I think, on the internet. I mean, that was great. I saw that video passed around many times, and we'll talk about that in depth. You have a history of that. I want to talk about your history of going right at people as a journalist, as a journalist should. But first we got to talk about this rally that just happened last Sunday, 5 days ago, called the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, one of them. Lincoln Memorial, which I watched and was very controversial for a lot of reasons. And you were there, and you and I know many of the people who spoke there because we've both been involved sort of in the anti-war movement for, I think, our entire adult lives, right? And I think you and I are the same age too. So, so why don't you just, how did you perceive it? What did you see happen there?
The Rage Against the War Machine.
Yeah.
I thought it was a good protest. It was pretty much what I expected it would be. It wasn't huge, but it was at least 2,000, maybe as much as 3,000 or 4,000 people, and some, speakers that I thought were very good. I used to go to protests and think, we're going to bring down the empire today, and now it's just like,
Me too.
A social occasion to reconnect with old friends and to meet new friends, stuff like that. So I didn't listen to every word. If you watched it, you probably heard more of what happened on the stage than I did. But I also didn't, hear anything that I tremendously disagreed with. I thought the most interesting speaker might have been Kucinich, because he didn't use the word impeachment, but he talked about Congress confronting Biden and sort of implied impeachment there. Because, I mean, Biden's got the votes now, but he doesn't have the law. I mean, the US is participating in a war without actual congressional authorization. And he also mentioned gain of function work, which I don't think anybody else did. But there were a lot of other really, important speakers, and I've long been an advocate of, for a number of reasons, of left-right cooperation. I think, even if it fails, it works, because it gives you someplace to go. Because if you don't have that place to go, say you're a leftist and you don't exercise this possibility, then you're pretty much a slave to the Democratic Party for all intensive purposes. I would argue.
Yeah, so people who don't know, I mean, you have a history of writing for very clearly left-wing outlets like The Nation. Who else have you written for who's like very much on the left?
Counterpunch, Consortium News, Common Dreams way back when,
right.
Salon. So yeah.
And you're a man of the left.
Fair. Yeah. No. I mean, I came to politics because of, Noam Chomsky and such, in large part. But I've, sort of, found something of an independent path at times as well.
Yeah. Was war or foreign policy your first issue? It was for me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there were other things that I felt strongly about when I was young, the death penalty, and other things. But yeah, I think definitely, war and civil liberties, I suppose, also were my main animating things. Okay.
Are you a socialist?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. I think so. I think it's utterly perverse that you have people who are billionaires and people who don't have enough to eat. I mean, my only caveat would be is that I tend to sort of outflank people who confine themselves to a nationalist framework. So, I mean, I look at things like global inequality. And
right. That's my favorite. Let's talk about that for a second and get back to war in a minute. Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite things, to the typical Bernie bro, right, who's demanding redistribution of resources. Right.
That's off the agenda.
I say terrific, but I mean, the first people who are going to get the money it's not you, dude. Like in Brooklyn, it's going to be the global South has a say here first, don't you think?
Right. Absolutely.
If you're really interested in inequality or in equality, yeah. So yeah, I think I told you this before, but I was born a leftist. My parents were Trotskyist revolutionaries, and I remained firmly on the socialist left well into my 30s, into graduate school, and I changed later. But the thing that I came to politics with first was a hatred of war, and had nightmares about being in World War I when I was a kid, like being on the battlefield, which I still remember those dreams, those nightmares. And I was taken to anti-war protests when I was very little. I was protesting the Vietnam War in a stroller.
So, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah. And in fact, Ronald Reagan tear gassed me and my parents during an anti-Vietnam War rally here in Berkeley. Is a famous moment. He had the National Guard drop tear gas out of helicopters onto these protesters on the Berkeley campus.
So we're talking very early 70s, or
we're talking, that would have been right around very late 60s, 69 or 70, somewhere around there. Yeah, I know I was in preschool at the time, but yeah. So my politics fairly radically changed later in life, as I said, in my 30s. But the one thing that has not changed one bit is my commitment to doing whatever I can to stop the next world war from happening. I mean, that's the only issue on which I have remained firm and solid and unchanging, and just as passionate about now as I was then. And that's all of my work, the books I write, the articles I write, everything I write about foreign policy. I mean, and I would think this is what would sort of animate everybody who writes about these things, is to stop the next world war. Those are the worst things that have ever happened in human history. Close to 100 million people were killed in World Wars I and II. And right now we are maybe, quite possibly, closer to something like a world war than at any time since 1945. And it seems to me that very, very few people who talk about, who write about, who think about these issues, about foreign policy questions and international relations, have that as their objective. I know that you and I are the same on this, seems like, right?
I believe so.
So when I changed my politics around other issues, I became principally interested in bringing together people on the left who were as committed to stopping war as I was, and people on the right. So I started with libertarians because they were the most obvious and have been consistently anti-war in really good ways pretty much forever. And then with the emergence of the MAGA right, who are not, I wouldn't say anti-war, but they're certainly at least sharp critics of the American empire, I said, this is a golden opportunity to come together and forge a broad coalition of all kinds of people. Rednecks in Alabama and hipsters in Brooklyn can join together on this cause, around opposing the American empire and stopping war. And that's happened a little bit, I think we, and I'm going to say we, because it's like you and I and the people we hang out with, got together with people on the right and the left when Obama was about to bomb Syria many years ago. And he decided not to. And we had huge protests in the street. I was in protests in LA where I was living. They were all over the country. And it was pretty clear that Obama was responding to that public pressure when he decided not to send in bombs to Syria. Of course, he did a lot of other terrible things, and we did nothing to stop the Syrian civil war or the the U.S. Horrific participation in that war. But nonetheless, we did stop something. So it's, we have a precedent. We showed that it's possible. And Rage Against the War Machine, this rally was another attempt to do just that. And it brought together people on the right and people on the left. There were many members, as well as co-organized by the Libertarian Party and the People's Party, which I don't know much about, but I guess it's sort of it's left wing in some way or another. You had Ron Paul and Scott Horton sharing a stage with Max Blumenthal, who's a socialist, and Dennis Kucinich, who's very left wing, and many others. So it was that. That also turned out to be the problem with the Rage Against the War Machine rally, because it was attacked from the left mostly, but also the right to some extent. People said that you shouldn't get on stage with white supremacists, assuming that anybody who doesn't vote Democrat is a white supremacist, or who isn't a socialist is a white supremacist. But this was a very controversial protest, and it suffered from it. I think it had far fewer people show up because of that, and I think got much less coverage because of that. And I was pretty depressed by it, actually. I don't know. So what do you think about all that and the controversy?
Yeah, no, I thought that a lot of the attacks were not good faith, as they say. I've noticed this first of all, my interest in left-right stuff sort of goes back, I think, at least till the first Gulf War. Mm-hmm. In what the establishment then derided as the McGovern-Buchanan axis.
Yeah.
That was the term then. And I think that's part of what inspired me to come up with my Vote Pact voting strategy. It was envisioning a candidate or candidates, running from what I call the radical center, anti-war, pro-civil liberties, anti-corporate trade, and drawing support from, people from the left and right in pairs, so that would be the voting strategy. And you would immunize the candidate from the so-called spoiler problem. I kind of pleaded with NATO to do this in 2000 and 2004, and he pretty much passed on it. But I still think that that's a viable strategy. And I am hoping that this recent protest helps really get people to refocus on the possibility of that, because I think that it really is the keystone, or it could be the keystone for how we manifest meaningful change. I think it's very disingenuous, the attacks in terms of, it's totally accepted that me, as somebody who's generally on the left, that I should join with warmongers to help save Social Security. But somehow it's forbidden for me to work with
Right.
people who are against war,
Right.
but don't want Social Security or want to privatize Social Security or whatever. And I don't see how you get there. I don't see, as important as Social Security is. I mean, it kept, my parents in the middle class. So I'm for it. I think it's important. But I don't see how that trumps or even other far more insignificant issues, frankly, the issues of war and peace and nuclear war and so on. So there is this, sort of primacy of issues that keep people in their partisan boxes. And once you're in your partisan box, you can't think straight. Everything that you do becomes calculation as to how it benefits your political faction. You end up as an appendage or an appendage of an appendage to the Democratic Party. I wrote a piece about the protest, and I also wrote another piece critiquing the peace movement in terms of it had a global aspect to it too. During the buildup to the Iraq invasion in 2002, 2003, you saw the largest global anti-war protests on February 15th, 2003. The establishment at the time, the New York Times, called, there was just sort of a silence for 24 hours. The New York Times called, global public opinion as manifested by the protests, the second superpower. That is the only force that could possibly stand up to the U.S. empire. The so-called peace movement turned its back on that. Actually, the so-called leaders of the peace movement were actually initially against that protest in the United States. People who would later take credit for it, like Leslie Kagan and so on, they actually voted against it when it originated in Europe.
Why did they oppose it at first?
I don't know. I just know that fact. I talked to people who were part of the coalition there. But I've written about this, and I'm pretty sure Leslie Kagan is aware of my critique, but I never interviewed her about what her alleged reasons were. Right. And I wasn't in those meetings. But what they did after that point was they had protests in 2004, 2006, 2008 in the late summer or fall. That is, helping the Democratic Party to get Bush out. They politicized the anti-war movement and morphed it from this great potential of global force to an appendage of the Democratic Party. So when people say that Obama turned his back on the anti-war movement, I differ from that. The anti-war movement betrayed its own principles, and that led to the worst possible Obama and the implosion of the anti-war movement.
Well, wouldn't you also say that he used the anti-war movement to get elected?
I do. Right. I do. But if the anti-war movement had conducted itself more seriously and maintained its global perspective and alliances, then he would have had to somewhat conform to that. Right. They sort of abdicated their position, so you ended up with, I would argue, the worst possible Obama.
Yeah, I mean, he was identified by the media when he first started running for president as the anti-war candidate. He was associated very closely with the anti-war movement. I think there was a
right. I mean, he gave one speech where he said, "I'm against dumb wars" or something like that. It was, so meager, but
Well, that to me said that should have been enough, for everyone to understand who he was, and it turned out very quickly who he was, because he wrote that article in Foreign Affairs, I think in 2007, renewing American leadership, like calling for, maintenance of the global American hegemon. I mean, and then of course, as president, we all know what he did, which was carry out that project. But yeah, it was a cynical use of the anti-war movement. I hadn't thought about that before you just said that. But yeah, the Democrats definitely used the anti-war movement to get their guy elected in 2008.
Oh, absolutely. But I think, the leadership of the anti-war movement, I think, were willful in that, and eventually, basically led the anti-war movement to its own demise. Although, as you say, it revived somewhat in 2013.
Yeah.
As a left-right thing.
Mm-hmm.
It had lost its global perspective, but the other lever that it can use is an alliance with the left, with the right. I mean, I'd always been impressed by, by Ron Paul when he was in Congress. I mean, his critique of U.S. militarism was far stronger than anybody on the left. In Congress. I remember being in a meeting with him and Conyers. Conyers was mealy mouthed, and Ron Paul was like, "Let's burn this thing down."
That sounds right. Yeah. The other thing that happened with the election of Obama was that the anti-war movement just disappeared overnight. From its height in 2003, when millions of us were marching in the streets against the Iraq War, to basically nothing. There was a brief moment in 2013, but, from 2008, certainly, to 2013, no one would come out, right? I mean, how many people would come out on the street and protest during those years against war? I mean,
yeah, it's very few. And I mean, it's kind of particularly ridiculous because, I mean, protesting against Bush, he's not going to listen to you. Right. I mean, it's like somebody, waving their hand at a restaurant only when the waiter is looking away. And then if the waiter looks towards you or might look towards you, and Obama might, then they're all silent when Obama's there, even though they presumably had some influence over him.
Right.
So yeah, I thought it was perverse in a lot of ways. I mean, there were some protests, but they were very small and minor, and Catholic worker types, and people like that. Right.
The Christian pacifists are they're the only people who have remained constant, really, since like World War II, actually. A common claim made by people kind of on my side, I wonder if you have the same feeling, is that what people were protesting at the anti-war protests in 2003, 2004 was not war, but Republicans. That it was an anti-Republican war protest, not an anti-war protest. And so once they got their guy in office, once the wars were being led by Democrats, it was fine with them. Does that sound right?
Somewhat. I mean, you have different people and different strains. I mean, you certainly had Obama, bombing Libya, and threatening Syria. I mean, it's partially because of the mass scale of the Iraq War. I do think that was, part of it, and that it was an outright invasion. And it, whereas Libya had sort of a, better veneer of multilateralism through NATO, which is phony multilateralism, but still, and this, sort of responsibility to protect the veneer as well. So I certainly think that was part of it, but I think the sheer scale of the Iraq invasion, does account for part of it.
I used to love drinking coffee, but early last year I developed an irregular heartbeat from all the caffeine I was consuming. But then I found out about Magic Mind, a delicious shot of elixir that contains several powerful nootropics and adaptogens which boost energy, improve my focus, and stabilize my mood, all while reducing stress. Magic Mind is now the central part of my morning routine. It helps me stay focused with just the right energy level, with no spike in cortisol, and no heart racing. Magic Mind contains matcha, which boosts energy and contains huge amounts of antioxidants, ashwagandha, which reduces stress and anxiety, lion's mane and cordyceps, which increase endurance and reduce inflammation, as well as vitamins B and D3, which support cognitive performance and boost the immune system. Go to magicmind.co/unregistered and use my discount code unregistered20 to get 40% off your first subscription or 20% off your first one-time purchase. Now, my 40% off code only lasts for 10 days, so hurry. Again, go to magicmind.co/unregistered and use my discount code unregistered20. Thank you.
For me, and I've been writing a book for a very, very long time on the history of U.S. foreign policy. And the thing that's really, really striking to me is that if you were to look at a list, a roster of all the people who have made major foreign policy decisions in the United States since the founding of the country, I mean, 200 people?
Yeah.
Maybe something like that. I mean, all the major decisions about war and peace, something like that. I mean, there's been this teeny tiny little clique that they've all gone to the same school, same university. They're all from the same neighborhoods, certainly from the same class, same culture. And every single one of them, except for Donald Trump, has believed wholeheartedly, including Obama, in a global American empire. And I'm talking about the founding fathers too, by the way. They all had visions of a global empire. People don't know this, but but it's just been complete uniformity on that question. Should the United States be a global empire? And they have all known that to be God's truth. So in other words, like all these momentous decisions that have resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people around the globe, very few people know about it. Very few people are aware of it. It's also very difficult to follow foreign affairs. I understand, knowing all these things about other countries is not easy, but, the fact that it's such this little closed society making all these huge decisions, just makes it so difficult to penetrate. And so that's why I write books about this, and that's why I write articles about it. That's why I have a podcast and all that. But like when you go and stand right in front of those very people making those big decisions, it's the thing that we have to have happen. And as I said at the beginning, I have literally dreamed of that my whole life, of not just myself, but journalists just going and just standing in front of these people and asking them direct questions about what they're doing. So you've been doing that for a while, going to news conferences that you're kind of not supposed to be at, or, getting credentials for news conferences where they certainly don't want you, and then asking really tough, unexpected questions. When did you start doing that?
It depends by what you mean by that. I mean, I started doing, call-ins to WNYC in New York.
Oh, cool.
And the shows that they had there, when they had officials, I remember calling into Madeleine Albright in the 90s at some point, and some other officials.
Is this the Brian Lehrer show?
Yeah, Brian Lehrer and Lenny Lopate.
Right.
They're the two shows there. And then Talk of the Nation occasionally when that sprang up. So that's sort of how I got a bit of my start. And then in my day job, I used to have a tiny office at the National Press Building. So I would go to news conferences at the press club and ask tough questions there. And, it soon became apparent to me that, access was the key. And then I got the bright idea of going to the Sunday morning talk shows because these people physically have to walk out of the building, and there's a stakeout there, so like, whatever, Colin Powell will go to CBS and get, softball questions, and then he'll walk out, and CNN will have a camera crew there, and they'll ask him the same softball questions, and that's it. So I was like, okay, so I hired a cameraman and ran around on Sunday morning from show to show, and asked them tough questions as they walked out of there as best as I could.
Do you remember any of those questions?
Oh yeah, sure. Sure. I actually just posted one on my Substack because the anniversary just happened of the Iraq invasion, I asked Colin Powell about something that's very little understood, and that is how torture produced the phony evidence for war. Right? I mean, the liberal mantra is that torture doesn't work. That's false. Torture works great to get a false confession, to produce false information, like, so they're not, torturing people saying, tell us when the next terrorist attack is. They're torturing people saying, tell us that Iraq and Al-Qaeda are working together. And eventually somebody's going to say, okay, will it make you stop torturing me? Yes, Iraq and Al-Qaeda are working together. And that ended up in Colin Powell's speech at the UN to make the case for the Iraq war. And I confronted him about that, and he, pretended to be ignorant, even though his chief of staff, Larry Wilkerson, had written about this. So there were, a couple of times where I, got in there and I tried to move the ball forward. I think one time I confronted Kerry about Chelsea Manning, then Chelsea Manning, and
or no, it would have been Bradley Manning at the time, right?
No, we're talking
something after.
Yeah, I think before the change, but anyway,
okay.
Private Manning, and shortly after that, they took him out of solitary confinement or something. So I felt like, just it showed me that there's a certain power, and you ask a question, they when they're confronted with it, that it might actually affect policy.
Right.
That came to a screeching halt when I made some waves asking the Saudi ambassador at the press club about the legitimacy of the Saudi regime, just as the Arab uprisings were starting.
The general legitimacy of the regime, like
yes,
whether it should exist.
Yeah, well, and I got suspended from the National Press Club for boisterous and unseemly conduct. The ethics committee overrode that suspension, but no one stopped for me when I went out for my Sunday stakeouts after that for like more than a month. So, I don't know how word got around exactly, but word clearly got around, and nobody was stopping for me. And it's exhausting. I got a day job, and then I'm, doing that on my weekends, and that, it's an infinite loop. So that's part of the history of what I've done. But now I've been getting into the State Department. I got into the State Department some during the Trump administration. And I've started doing so again the last month or so.
So there's a great clip of you at a Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin joint press conference, I guess it was about 4 years ago. And you got literally dragged out of the room, and it was on CNN. It was widely covered, and it's kind of an amazing moment. Although I think that in all the coverage of it, the actual issue you were trying to draw attention to is completely lost. I don't think anybody could tell you. In fact, I'm struggling to think about it myself. Like, what exactly I knew it was about nuclear weapons treaties. That's pretty much all I know about it. Do you want to talk about that? Because that was an amazing moment, and it was also right in the height of Russiagate too, I believe, right? And
right.
And so you were there not to like when every other liberal or left-wing journalist would have been there to just ask him questions about Russiagate and collusion. You had no interest in that whatsoever. You wanted to go straight at something maybe more important.
Just that year, the 122 countries backed the nuclear weapon ban treaty to ostensibly get rid of nuclear weapons. I actually have some criticisms of the treaty, so I'm not backing it, but it struck me as incredible that neither Trump nor Putin were asked about this. And the US, along with its NATO allies and a few others, and Russia, were doing everything they possibly could to sink the treaty. So again, the problem of access. How do I, in a room of, hundreds of journalists, this huge hall, it was their big summit, in Helsinki. Trump and Putin were meeting, I think for the first and only time when they were both in office.
Mhm.
And, how do I get them to call on me? So I came up with a bright idea of having a sign. It's right there, nuclear weapon ban
Awesome.
treaty. And to hold it up and hope that one of them would be so, impetuous to call on me as a result of that. And another journalist snitched on me. He saw me writing the sign, when we were, waiting for hours and hours in the press facility, and told them that I was planning a protest. And I wasn't. I was just going to hold up the sign, and if they called on me, great. And if they weren't, then that was the end of the day. So they, game questioned me. I left the room, came back to the room. Other journalists were asking what the hell was going on. I held up my sign just to explain to the other journalists what's going on. And then they grabbed me and literally dragged me out and held me in a cell until midnight, which is when the press centers closed. So I couldn't get my message out that day, which is what I thought they would do. I told the prison guards there when they were, taking my belt off and, doing everything to lock me up, they're going to let me out at midnight. I know it, because that's when the press centers are going to close. And that's exactly what happened. So I tried as best as I could to get my message out as to what I was actually asking about. I was going to ask about, the nuclear weapon ban treaty. Why are you blocking this attempt to finally genuinely implement the nuclear? Nobody knows the nuclear non-proliferation treaty has two components. Other countries will not acquire nuclear weapons, and the incumbent nuclear powers are supposed to make good faith efforts to get rid of their own nuclear weapons forthwith. It's some kind of, ambiguous line. And they, of course, haven't done a damn thing. And every 5 years, there's a conference at the UN where the nuclear powers say, yeah, we're going to get rid of them any day now. Or, what, they don't say that, but they pretend to go through the machinations of saying they're going to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and they, have no, intention of doing so. So the nuclear weapon ban treaty was an alleged attempt to, really put some teeth into that. I still think that the treaty has some merit, but there are some genuine problems with it, which, I can't go into now. And I was also going to ask Trump about Israel's nuclear weapons. Again, no U.S. president has acknowledged that Israel has nuclear weapons. It's a completely absurd position. So I was going to toss that out there as well. And I don't think no, that's not true. Helen Thomas asked Obama. This was her first question to Obama about are any countries in the Middle East have nuclear weapons?
Oh, this is another time.
Another time.
Yeah, right.
I was about to say no sitting president has been asked this question.
Right.
Then that's not true. Helen Thomas, partly at my urging, asked Obama that. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to ask about, and again, couldn't be a more important topic. And the Finnish authorities, whoever was talking to them in their earpieces, shut me down and dragged me out of there.
So another journalist snitched on you?
Yeah.
Who was this?
I've forgotten his name. I should write this up at some point. He's with the BBC.
BBC?
Yeah.
They're the worst.
Yeah, they are.
They're even worse than the Yankees. So what during that press conference, and it was just a joint conference with Putin and Trump, right? It was just the two of them taking questions from the press.
It was a big, it was their big summit.
Right. So the leaders of Russia and the United States are here. The media has access to them and can ask them anything they want. And what did the people there ask them about? I guess you weren't there for much of it, but before you got yanked out, what were they asking about?
Yeah, they wouldn't even let me listen to it. And I, of course, read the transcript the next day, or that evening, I guess. They were utterly banal questions. Some probably were about Russiagate, some I think on the U.S. side, they were about Russiagate. On the Russian side, it was like U.S. journalists all on one.
Huh.
It was a huge hall, and on one side were all the U.S. journalists, and on the other side were all the Russian journalists, basically.
Hmm.
The Russian journalists were about policy, but not about nuclear policy in that regard.
So why is that? Why were they allergic to taking questions about nuclear policy? It's not like this is a secret entirely. I mean, everyone knows that both countries have all the nuclear bombs, or 90% of the nuclear bombs. And, I mean, even though Americans don't care enough about this issue, we do care somewhat. And I think there's general agreement that nuclear war is bad. And, like, why was it so out of bounds and beyond the pale to them? I mean, to the establishments, I guess, both in Russia and the United States, for you to ask a question about this?
Well, I mean, certainly my question, questions, again, the legitimacy of their power, right? I mean, if a large part of the power of the United States government and the Russian government is their capacity to blow up the planet, that's not legitimate power. That's not, economic growth or cultural enlightenment or anything like that. That's like, we are the fulcrum of global politics because we can blow up the planet. That's the source of their power. That's the ring that they hold, and that's not legitimate. And I don't think that either of them want that questioned.
Yeah. So it was actually an existential threat to them.
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to destroy the countries, but it's a threat to
their power,
their illegitimate power. Yes.
Yeah, to their power. Yeah, the guys on stage there, right?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, so now, but you've been doing this again recently. You've been getting into the halls of power and asking the wrong questions. And I guess you first did this in the State Department recently, right?
Yeah.
So how did that happen? Why? I mean, and yeah, just tell the story. Like, why did you start doing this again?
Because I was, trying to find a lever for, getting information out there and to actually try to inject some scrutiny into policy. I think that the tougher the questions at a news conference, the more peaceful the outside world.
I love that. You said that 4 years ago, and I was going to quote that. I was going to quote that actually. I have it written down right here. It's fantastic. Is that really true though? I mean, let's think about this for a second. I want that to be true.
I'm not saying like go in there and have a food fight or something like that. I'm saying,
do what you do.
If it's all schmoozy, then they're getting away with something,
right?
and it could well be murder. But if it's tough and substantial and getting at the heart of important issues, then there's a genuine chance that they will not be able to exercise a legitimate authority.
I mean, it actually is about literally getting away with murder.
Correct.
In this case, if we're talking about foreign policy of the United States, we're talking about many people dead as a result of foreign policy decisions in this country, tens of millions.
Absolutely.
Over 200 years. So yeah, I love that. The more aggressive journalism becomes, the more likely we will live in peace.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive because the people are like, "Oh, you're being rude or something." No, I'm being caring about the outside world, and if you're, it's the First Amendment is use it or lose it. If you don't use it, then might as well not be there.
Okay, now here's the issue. That presumes that the more information the American people have, the less likely they are to support wars.
Yeah, it's not, axiomatic that that's true, that they would be less likely to support wars, but I think that's true. And I think that the system puts so much effort into creating false narratives that, I think it's probably true in significant part. I mean, another big issue that I worked on was the Iraq War, Iraq WMDs, and Iraq sanctions throughout the 1990s. They were just silently suffocating hundreds of thousands of people in a country. And so whenever I got a chance, I was, and that's probably what I, questioned Albright about when I, called in to some talk shows,
Mm.
and then in person at the press club, would question U.S. officials about their continued sanctions on Iraq, which were all, it was all a scam. It was all falsified. It was all based on the lie that if Saddam Hussein would comply with the weapons inspectors, then we would lift the sanctions. That wasn't the policy. If you
Mhm.
look closely at what their policy was we're going to keep the sanctions in place until we oust Saddam Hussein. Those are two different things. And they continuously tried to obscure that in order that so that they could continue the sanctions. And I kept, getting back at that. And I mean, you might recall that culminated in the late 90s with substantial protests. When Clinton was trying to bomb Iraq, he got pushback. I don't know if you remember the Ohio State Town Hall.
Mm-mm.
It was a fascinating episode that you basically had a mini uprising on CNN with Albright, Sandy Berger, and Bill and Pentagon head Cohen, and you had these regular people coming up to the microphone saying, "What are you doing here?"
Really?
Yeah, it was a fascinating episode.
Wow.
I've written this up. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please.
Um,
Huh.
and I mean, I've been writing these historic pieces. When Albright died, I wrote a piece that touched on that, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm working now on a piece on Jimmy Carter, and it
Mm.
highlights what you were saying earlier about how it's just a clique of, I mean, I haven't studied, you know, 19th century,
It's the same.
or 18th century. Yeah, I assume it's the same.
Same.
I've
It's,
studied.
it's not even it's not even a faction. It's a
Yeah,
clique. It's this
yeah,
microscopic little group of people.
yeah,
And
yeah.
all the
I mean,
decisions.
that's certainly what I found in terms of
Mhm.
my examination of the last several decades.
Mhm.
Um, and and I've used these deaths to sort of highlight, what's, what the threads are, and they're remarkable. And
I-
yeah,
yeah, I had Catherine Ebright on the show a few months ago. I think she's Richard Ebright's daughter, but anyway, she does really great
really,
work on the Secret Wars.
Hmm.
And for the Brennan Center, she came out with a report a couple months ago based on Nick Terce's original work, but she kind of developed it into a big report about all the wars going on, all the military activity around the world that Congress does not know about. Like members of the Armed Services Committee of the United States Congress were unaware. Remember, was it in Niger? The 4 U.S. soldiers were killed in Niger.
Hmm. Hmm.
And members of the Senate Armed Services Committee did not know that the United States was in that country.
Hmm.
If they don't know, this is a pretty small clique making all the decisions.
Right.
So yeah, actually, let's think about this for a second about public opinion and war, right? No, I think you might be right, because with the Iraq War, with the Iraq II, 2003, I think it's safe to say that what pushed most ordinary Americans to support the war was the weapons of mass destruction claim and the alleged ties between Saddam and Al Qaeda, right? It was those two, I think. In other words, like Saddam's ability and intention to do harm to us is
Right,
what really.
and particularly, in the aftermath of the trauma of the 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. Yes.
Right, but it was his sort of lethal, the lethal threat he constituted to us,
Correct.
right? And so we all know those are both complete lies, derived in part from torturing people to tell us these things. I mean, that's the most macabre part of the most macabre story right there. That's just amazing. But I'd forgotten about that. So yeah, I mean, I think if you had, and journalists like you had, let it be known that the WMDs were bullshit and the Al Qaeda link was bullshit.
Oh
I
yeah.
think
I mean, I
I
did.
think
I mean, I was putting out news releases at the time, prior to the invasion of Iraq. I couldn't quite prove that Iraq didn't have WMDs. That was difficult to prove, but you could prove a pattern of lying.
right.
You could prove, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, and that's what I did. From even before, but especially in 2002 and
Mhm.
early 2003, I just put out a regular stream of things documenting the Bush administration's lies on those questions.
Right. But I mean, I'm not sure I'm not sure when Scott Ritter made his intervention that year. Do you remember what month he came out? Basically showing it was well after the invasion started, right? I mean, it was.
Oh, no. Scott Ritter, Scott Ritter started dissenting from policy in 98.
Oh,
And you know who slapped him down was Joe
Joe
Biden.
Biden. Yeah. There's a great clip on YouTube you can see. Wait, no, I meant his work on the WMDs in particular. When he debunked that claim. Was that before the invasion?
Yeah, before the invasion. Oh,
Oh, it
definitely.
was.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, with my day job, we almost took a trip with Scott Ritter to Iraq. We did several trips, one with James Aberesk, who also just entered hospice and who I'm writing a piece about, a former senator, radical senator. I mean, he would put to shame, the pretenses of the squad today, the stuff that James Aberesk did in the 1970s. We went with him and Nick Ray Hall, who's a sitting congressman at the time, and with a former UN Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General Dennis Halliday, who's head of the Oil for Food Program. And we tried to go, and we went with Sean Penn, better version of Sean Penn.
Lord.
And we tried to go with Scott Ritter, and it was literally days before our planned trip to Iraq with Scott Ritter that the story about his alleged interactions with underage girls,
Oh my God,
the internet broke.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I mean, I know that it has been said that he was set up by.
Yeah. Well, the timing would certainly indicate that it was
Wow.
part of a.
Wow.
So it seemed. I mean, I think that there is an issue there, but I think that I suspect that when somebody gets too big for their britches, that the establishment finds a way to hone in on their vulnerabilities to undermine and discredit them.
Yeah, he did what he did, and it's sort of incontrovertible that he did try to talk to a 15-year-old girl. He thought he was, but it was also a sting operation.
Correct.
Right. And so that's, why did they conduct that sting operation, which, at that moment against that guy, again, in that particular part of the country. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's interesting. So actually, can we talk about Jimmy Carter? I'm dying to hear your take on this guy, because he's about to die, and everybody's, already mourning the loss of a great peace activist, apparently. Peace loving. He was our one peace loving president, Sam. Don't you know that? What's wrong with you?
Yeah, get with the program. Still haven't finished it, but first off, I asked him once at the press club about Israel's nukes, and he kind of lied to me. Good old Jimmy Carter kind of lied to me.
A man of the faith? What?
Yeah, because he said that he let other countries declare or not declare their nuclear weapons. And I didn't know this when I was questioning him, but then I looked it up, and his administration actually determined that Pakistan had nuclear weapons and proceeded to cut off funding to Pakistan before Pakistan declared that it had nuclear weapons. So he lied. And he also told me that he wasn't really familiar with Mordecai Vanunu, who was the Israeli whistleblower who exposed Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal and ended up in solitary confinement for 15 years. And is still not allowed to leave Israel. He's still sort of pleading to get the hell out.
Wow.
It's not true. He met him in a restaurant. I mean, it was just a coincidence, but I later found out that they'd actually met in a restaurant. So there was that. But more broadly, I mean, Carter, I don't know if you know Iqbal Ahmed and Patrick Seal. They had both criticized the Camp David Accords, which everybody reveres as a great stepping stone for peace and so on, as a very Machiavellian step to get Egypt out of its Arab milieu, and that in effect helped Israel secure the realm, as they say, to, push Egypt aside, and helped the rise of Israel, to some extent Saudi Arabia. And
Mhm.
Iqbal Ahmed argued that it led to the rise of Saddam Hussein.
Oh my.
Because with Egypt out of the way and isolated in the Arab world, someone like Saddam Hussein could assert himself as the vanguard of Arab nationalism,
Oh,
whereas
right.
traditionally with Nasser,
Yeah.
the center was always Egypt.
Oh,
Um,
right.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So
that's interesting.
I mean, it really highlights to me, and of course, it was Brzezinski, and
Yep.
they brought in, um, they provoked Russia into invading Afghanistan,
Afghanistan.
and Brzezinski says that if we give them this,
Oh, that's right.
if we give this aid, the secret aid, to these Afghan fighters, that'll provoke a Soviet intervention. Goody goody. Um,
Right.
and then I never put the pieces together until I started working on this piece. And then the fact that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan was used as the pretext to start the rapid deployment force and the Carter Doctrine, which basically said no outside interference into the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
When Reagan came in, he quickly morphed that into protect Saudi Arabia at all cost, and the rapid deployment force that Carter had put together morphed into CENTCOM, which would be the mechanism for attacking Iraq and Afghanistan. So you really see how, I've grown to see the empire is at the core of the US system, and each president plays a role in doing that. And everything is weaponized for it. Peacemaking,
Mm-hmm.
in the case of Egypt, Camp David, is weaponized for the cause of empire. Feminism for the cause of invading Afghanistan is
Gay
weaponized
rights.
in
Gay
the name of
rights.
gay rights now.
Trans
Everything,
rights. Yep.
the empire is at the core, and everything is subservient to that and is instrumentalized by it. That's been my conclusion in looking at all of this.
That is exactly what I've been saying for many, many years. Exactly right. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. The use of I guess you'd call it the LGBT movement against to demonize Putin is
Yeah.
real. That's a story that someone needs to tell. I mean,
Yeah.
because I noticed that years ago during the Sochi Olympics when, I noticed like my sort of normie liberal friends suddenly talking about Vladimir Putin. I was like, you don't even know who he is. But the one thing they knew about him was that he hated gays.
Right.
And they knew, therefore, he was a really bad guy. And then, of course, the Russiagate was, made possible by that original intervention. But it's incredible how they've weaponized trans rights and gay rights to advance the empire globally. That's the big untold story. I don't know if anybody's really done that yet. Someone needs to write a book on that. But so yeah, Jimmy Carter, and then he's also doing stuff in Central America, right, and kind of setting up the war against the Sandinistas and all that, right? Yeah, okay, so Ukraine. If can you imagine if most Americans knew the history of that conflict before February 24th, 2022? Can you imagine if most Americans knew what happened in 2014 and 2015 and the next 8 years, and they knew what happened with the color revolutions and what the color revolutions were really about, right? I mean, these are the things. Again, if we had more aggressive journalists asking those questions and telling those stories, more importantly, I do think there would be maybe not support for Russia, which I don't want anyway, but we would certainly have. I mean, it just seems to me, if you know that history, it seems to me almost impossible to construct an argument, a persuasive argument that the United States should fund Ukraine to the tune of $100 billion. I mean, I just don't see how any very, very few Americans, except for members of the Kagan family, would support this, right? I mean, it's just, and it's incredible how the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, never mention really anything that happened in Ukraine before February of last year.
Yeah, it was one of those moments that, everything is forgotten what happened before. That was sort of the case with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait as well.
Mm.
It's like, new day, and everything beforehand is forgotten. All of the provocations, all of the, people are regular, even realists who I, admire in some ways, always liken the U.S. the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and I think that's an absurd parallel.
Right. Totally, I saw your piece on that. Yeah.
I think the much closer parallel is the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which was highly provoked, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but illegal. And that's part of the reason that I mean, a lot of people on the left, or people who were debunking Russiagate and doing good work there, were dismissing the possibility of a Russian invasion a year ago, or a year and 2 days ago. And they were wrong, and I kind of knew that they were wrong at the time, because they were so used to the system propagandizing against Russia that all they could say was that the system is wrong. And you can't just get away with that. You actually have to roll up your sleeves and figure out what's right and wrong. We saw a similar dynamic with pandemic origins, where, the China bashers are saying that it might have come out of a lab, therefore it couldn't have come out of a lab. No, you can't think that way. You actually have to do the work. And part of the reason that I saw that Russia could invade Ukraine was that that was a formative event in my life when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and it's etched in my memory, and I'm well aware that you can have somebody who's opposed to the U.S. do something that's illegal. And you shouldn't discount that possibility, and how they're provoked into doing it. And that's the deeper story. And you're absolutely right. I think that, it's all distractions. I mean, the American public is so distracted in 50 million ways that they can't, that's part of it. They can't grasp what the Minsk agreements were, and so on and so forth, to actually see what's going on there. Although, the obvious deeper problem is just, an incredible bias towards the U.S. establishment.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, these things are truly difficult. I mean, I've been studying the Ukraine war every day for a year now, and I still am constantly trying to catch up on the basic story of it.
I agree.
And so, speaking of that, so a year ago and a couple days ago, there was actually another journalist in the State Department who was somewhat similar to you. This guy, Matt Lee, who I think he's with Associated Press. He was cornering your guy Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, about, because everybody, even anti-war people, were saying there's no way Russia's going to invade Ukraine. No way, no way. The only person I know of who was saying otherwise was Douglas McGregor at the time. And the State Department was saying, no, they are going to invade. And Matt Lee was asking sort of the tough questions. And a lot of people in the anti-war side.
That's right. Right. You're into Alex Jones territory here.
But we all loved what Matt Lee was saying, because we wanted Russia to, that we don't want it to be true that Russia was not invading. So I'm still pissed about this. It turns out Ned Price was actually correct in that, right, in that moment. But
well, I mean, technically speaking, he was asking for evidence, and Ned Price wasn't producing any evidence. So, right. I mean, I still wonder, and I haven't even broken this down as well as I might. I mean, Biden's threats towards Nord Stream were before the invasion.
That's right.
So I think in a lot of ways, they were, up until the day of the invasion, they were provoking the Russians. Blinken wouldn't take phone calls from his Russian counterpart during that time period as well. So so they were really, kind of spitting in their face. I'm pretty convinced that they wanted them to do it.
Oh yeah, I mean they've been provoking Russia to go to war in Ukraine since 2004, for God's sake. I mean, really, basically.
Yeah, but I think it accelerated. I mean, they wanted them to do it in that time period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I believe, was your first assault on the State Department after the Seymour Hersh piece?
All peace. That was my first back and forth with Ned Price. I was with an underling before that, and it didn't get any play. But first time I questioned Ned Price was on the Seymour Hersh thing.
Yeah. So this was just pure awesomeness, and I immediately tweeted it out, and I said that something like, "You're the only good journalist in the world," or something like that, or we need, or something like the appearance of good journalism suddenly in Washington D.C. But yeah, so Seymour Hersh comes out with this big long article basically a few weeks ago, in which, unfortunately, based on just the testimony of one unnamed source, which is the problem with his piece, but nonetheless, it's very, very detailed, very long, and it also, most importantly, just sort of comports what seems to me to be almost obvious. I mean, it just seems so farcical to deny this, that the United States blew up Nord Stream 2. Because, as you said, they've been promising it for many years. Not just Biden, but Victoria Nuland and others have been saying that they were not just that they wanted to blow it up, but they were going to somewhere or another.
I only remember it from the last year. I don't remember it going back further than that. It might have, but I'm not aware of it.
I believe they were making threats against Nord Stream from the get-go. In fact, I think even Condi Rice, way back when the deal was first made some noise about it.
It does ring a bell. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm quite sure Nuland said something about it also before the invasion. But yeah. So the Seymour Hersh, for those who don't know, I mean, probably the most decorated, esteemed investigative journalist of our lifetime. You know, he's the one who exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He was one of the first reporters to expose a lot of what Watergate was about. And then Abu Ghraib prison, that was Seymour Hersh doing that. I mean, just on and on and on. And his track record is pretty solid. He was also the first journalist, and this was when this was completely exotic to say this. He was the first to report on the United States funding Al-Qaeda in Syria. I mean, correct. And people just thought he was lunatic. Even I was reading that thinking, can this really be true? Yeah. And now it's accepted truth. We know this. So Seymour Hersh is the man, and needs to be taken seriously. But the New York Times did not mention this. The Washington Post did not mention his piece. CNN, all the Fox News, nobody talked about it. And you wanted to know what the United States government had to say about it. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. So, I laid out some of the facts around the case and asked Ned Price, is the U.S. government position credible? And he, did a quick, yeah, absolutely. And I just, repeated here. And then he kept trying to go to another reporter. And I kept trying to follow up to extract more information from him and more denials. He ended up, kind of smearing Hersh personally. Mm-hmm. I was tempted to respond to that, but I just sort of stuck to the issue at hand, and kept asking him about, I asked him if he read the piece, and he said he was familiar with it. So I seems not to have read the piece. Mm-hmm. And I outlined some aspects of the piece and asked him for a response. It got into the question of war powers, what you were sort of talking about earlier. Does Congress know what the hell is going on? Mm-hmm. So it got into some of that. That's not necessarily my favorite subject, but I thought it was important because, you don't know that these things are for the good. You hope that the American people, if they're provided the facts, will come to a reasonable conclusion. You hope that Congress will inject itself in a reasonable way. You don't have any assurances that they'll do so. So I went in that direction, and he claimed that they are upholding the war powers resolution.
Right.
There's serious question about that. And he claimed that they uphold the law in all instances. So the next time I saw him, I went in after you abide by the law in all instances. The Glenn Symington amendments to the Arms Export Act clearly state that the U.S. should cut off funding to any country that has done nuclear proliferation. Israel's clearly done nuclear proliferation twice. It got nuclear weapons for itself, and it also conducted a joint nuclear test with the apartheid government in South Africa. Desmond Tutu's last article was about this. It was an admonition to the Biden administration to acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons and to cut off funding to it by abiding by their own laws. And it was amazing to me that this article by Desmond Tutu appeared and was roundly ignored. And so I asked about that, and he refused to engage the issue. He just kept repeating. It was like, talking to a cult member or something, just like, we abide by the law in all instances. We abide by the law in all instances. I'm like, yeah, but I'm quoting a particular law. I'm quoting, what the specifics are. So I'm going to continue on different threads on this.
So according to Seymour Hersh,
Sorry, I kept
no.
questioning that. Yeah.
No, I want to clarify this, what you're saying. So according to Seymour Hersh, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, came up with the plan to bomb Nord Stream, the pipeline linking Russia and Germany.
Correct.
And then or the CIA, normally this is something the CIA would do, of course, because it's a covert operation. But according to Hersh, the CIA and Sullivan got the Defense Department to do it so that it wouldn't have to be reported to Congress. Is that correct?
Yes. And also, I didn't get into this with my questioning with him, and it's a really subtle point that Hersh made was that was part of the reason why the open threats, that is by Biden saying, Nord Stream will not go forward. Hersh claims that his source was saying that was their way of providing a legal rationale, because it was no longer a covert operation. It was an overt operation because they were stating basically that they would do it. And I should have found a way to work that into the question.
Wow.
Because it is sort of the cherry on top.
That is gangster.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a mafia state. Someone said that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So legally, this is all fine because it's the DOD doing it, and they don't have to tell Congress about it.
That's Hersh's story. Now, what I asked Price was, would you still have to report this to Congress under the War Powers Act? And he fundamentally said, yes, we would.
If they did it, which he denied.
If they did it, which he denies.
Right.
So if they didn't, then he's lying, and there might be a response from Congress. I don't know if they've come up with some crazy legal construct where they can, tell Congress about war powers, but it's secret. We don't know the levels of legal depravity that we're dealing with here necessarily. That's the lay of the land right now.
So what is Ned Price and company thinking about this, do you think? I mean, there's no other person or no other entity that could have done it. I mean, there's clearly Russia couldn't have done it or would not have done it. First of all, if they'd wanted to cut off the supply of gas, they could have just turned off the goddamn tap on their side of the pipe.
Right.
But they didn't want this, of course, because all they want to do is trade with Europe and other places, of course, and sell their damn oil and gas, because that's what they depend on.
Right.
And then no one else has the capability to blow up an undersea pipeline deep under the Baltic Sea that's off the coast of Sweden, in waters that are controlled by the United States Navy.
Well, I mean, I've heard people, and what Hersh's story is that it was done in conjunction with the Norwegian.
Norway.
Right. And I've heard people say that, it's possible that England could have done it. It's possible that one or two other NATO countries could have done it. But, So some people are speculating if it was more of a cutout thing where the U.S. had these other countries do it or gave them a tacit green light or whatever it is.
It's still the U.S.
It's
basically.
still effectively the U.S.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, I'm it's hard to play mind reader. I mean, it was clear from his body language that Ned Price was not happy to get this question. So I it made me further suspect that they were involved and that they didn't want to hear it, and that they wanted to do anything and everything they could to to marginalize this issue as much as possible.
So again, what do you think they're thinking though? Like they're just flat out, making bald-faced lies about this. And how do they think they're going to get away with this? Or
because things go down the memory hole,
right?
I mean, so many lies have gone down the memory hole,
right?
Like I was talking earlier about the Gulf War. You probably don't remember it, but when the U.S. after Iraq invaded Kuwait, the initial rationale for the U.S. getting involved was that there was a mass of Iraqi troops that were going to go on to further aggression against Saudi Arabia. And that's why we had to move in.
Right.
And then when some media outlet got private, satellite pictures, there was no army. So that was a huge lie. That was incredibly important at the time and totally debunked and totally forgotten that it was debunked. And then they found a new rationale for continuing their crime spree. Now, I mean, there were a lot of other things going on, but this is perhaps more brazen and more notable. But I think that they're banking on a similar thing. And, we have to try to, be as rigorous as possible and keep asking questions and be doing independent reporting and hope other people will step up.
Well, I mean, this is the theme of this. It's the theme of this conversation, right? Because no one knows about these things because journalists don't ask the questions. So, with the WMDs, most of the American people did not know that that was a lie until the war was effectively over, or at least the invasion had already been launched. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was based on a lie, which started the Vietnam War, that wasn't known to be a lie until the war was basically over. We didn't know about FDR forcing the Japanese basically to bomb Pearl Harbor until many years after that war was over. So they're probably just assuming the American people will, forget about this. And then 10 years from now, maybe there'll be some Senate report about how, actually, the United States did have something to do with blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, but no one will care by then.
Right. Yeah.
There you go.
And I think that's their hope, but it's not a done deal. And hopefully that there's an accumulated benefit to this. That is just the fact that you can accumulate these things and put that before the public, that people come to notice that, history is a living thing and that you could be living through a different version of the baloney that you understand in the past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was an act of war, not just against Russia, which is a nuclear superpower, but also against Germany, which is an American ally. I mean, this is cutting off the energy supply to civilians. Anyway, it just blows me away. But so, I'm so glad you did that. Let's keep doing more of that. I want people to listen to this and get inspired to go to the State Department themselves and ask the questions. And maybe we should, or
other venues. I mean, anybody and everybody can, their local representative, there are lots of opportunities that people might have to be doing that. And, I've often thought, that there should be a website to highlight this kind of activity, because it's not just stating your opinion. It's actually confronting somebody and forcing a response. So yeah, I mean, something that most people can do in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, we need a website with all the addresses and names of all the, all the moments, all the opportunities to go confront. our leaders, yeah, everyone has a congressperson and a senator, and almost all of them have voted wrong on these things, and so they need to be asked questions about it. So sure,
and
go
have
do
some
it,
form of town hall meeting or something.
or just take your phone and take video. That would be good too. All right, so we have not even talked about the most important thing.
Great. Great.
And last time you were on, we talked mostly about your incredible, so important work on the origins of the COVID virus. And I am so sick of even though I'm one of the people who was completely opposed to the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates, I am so sick of talking about that. And I wish that kind of my side or our side would just be done with that, and move on to the most important thing, which is getting to the bottom of where this thing started, why it started, how it started, and how to stop it from happening in the future. So most of the audience will know sort of the basics, I think, because they will have heard you and they will know from other places about, many people are theorizing now that COVID started in the Wuhan lab, and it was started by or as part of a project that was co-funded by the NIH, the US government. So what's happened since then? Where does this stand now? Where's the case? I've seen Jeffrey Sachs become very involved in this and speaking a lot about it, and I think really great ways, by the way. I've been very impressed with him. But there've been developments since you were on the show on this. What's going on?
It gets complicated. I don't know that it started in the Wuhan lab. I always say lab origin, and I don't specify which lab. I maintained from the beginning that there are a number of hypotheses here. It could have been an accident. That seems the most likely thing right now, that the Wuhan lab slipped on a banana peel, and that's how it started. That's perfectly plausible. There is the possibility that they were framed by some party. I'm very mindful of the anthrax attacks. People might recall the anthrax attacks happened right after the 9/11 attacks, where letters that said death to America, death to Israel, praise to Allah were sent to congressmen. Sent fear. People were afraid to open their mail, and that's the period that the Bush-Cheney junta started the Afghan invasion, and the Patriot Act was rammed through Congress. So, that's a bona fide false flag attack. So I've always held that out as a possibility here. I'm also honestly a little skeptical of Sachs, because he named Peter Daszak to head the WHO committee, the Lancet Commission committee on COVID origins, even though Sachs is a very sophisticated person, and Daszak had obvious brazen conflicts of interest that were well known in 2020. I was working on a piece on Daszak in the fall of 2020. I sent a letter to Sachs outlining the problems with Daszak. He didn't respond. I published my piece. I sent him another letter. Didn't respond. Not until the summer of 2021 did he finally pull the plug on Daszak. It kind of ate up a critical year of trying to get to the bottom of this. So again, it seemed like kind of what we were saying earlier. By the time the truth comes out, will anybody care? It seemed a way of eating up the clock a lot. So I feel this push and pull from a lot of what Sachs has been saying. He's right on a lot, and it feels like a complete breath of fresh air because nobody else with a substantial megaphone is saying it. But I have those problems, and I also, when he can put in his final report with the Lancet Commission, which he headed, he had Tedros on, the head of the WHO, and it was a total, give the WHO more money thing. And now we have the WHO treaty, which I have not gone through, but a lot of people have, who I respect, Meryl Nass, Francis Boyle, Whitney Webb, and they're saying that it's a power grab. I outline a bit of this. Again, I'm not a specialist in this, and Sachs seems mute on that. But let me talk about other developments here.
Okay. Well, wait, before you, let's do the Jeffrey Sachs piece first, because I've been,
Sure.
like a lot of people, I think I used to hate him because he was Mr. Globalist, and now I love him because he's Mr. Lab Leak Origin guy. And I think he's right about that. But so, I mean, I think I've heard him tell the story many times. But I think his telling is that he learned, like he was part of the establishment. He was with the Lancet. He was doing all these machinations to basically, I don't know if he was trying to hide anything, but he was going along with what they wanted, which was to obscure the origins of COVID for whatever nefarious reasons. And that he learned and he found out about who Daszak really was and about what was really happening with EcoHealth Alliance and all the rest of it, right? And so isn't that plausible that he just didn't know things at first, and then when he did learn what was going on, then he took the right course?
But the problems with Daszak were so obvious
Okay.
early on. I mean, he signed the Lancet letter in February of 2020, which dismissed the possibility of lab origin as a conspiracy theory. It was fairly clear at the time, and was totally confirmed by FOIA requests, that he organized that letter. He funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That was known by the spring of 2020. He claimed that this did not constitute a conflict of interest in any way, shape, or form. He was already on the WHO committee to find lab origins and was criticized for that reason. So, again, Sachs is a sophisticated guy who has played a nefarious role. And I mean, if you talk to somebody like Janine Waddell, who's a critic of the economic policies against Russia in the post-Soviet era, he sort of helped, and even more mainstream figures like Naomi Klein have criticized him for this. That he sort of let the barn, the horse out of the barn in terms of shock therapy against Russia that decimated the Russian economy, and then quickly washed his hands of it and criticized it. So he sort of played this role of facilitating something going horribly wrong, and then flipping and saying it's bad without really making an accounting. So I'm skeptical.
Okay.
I'm skeptical.
Okay.
So let me just give you a lay of the land of some other developments, and then a little bit about my research. Jeremy, there have been 2 hearings in the House on it, the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, and there's been some questioning and some minor government officials potentially perjuring themselves on some aspects of this. I've written one piece and another piece coming on that. The general problem is that it's the Democrats are largely continuing to be in denial about the possibility of lab origin. Still, it's incredible. Or minimizing the importance of it, or an outright denial of the very real possibility of it. The Republicans, there are some exceptions, but by and large are using it as a sort of get China kind of thing. And I'm afraid that, that's a recipe for letting U.S. lab work, much of which in effect constitutes biowarfare by a different name. Getting a pathogen, you're making it more deadly or more easily transmissible for the ostensible purpose of defending against it. that's just your stated goal. That's like the U.S. invading Iraq and saying that it's doing it to stop WMDs or to put in a democracy. That's just a stated goal. That there's no reason to believe that's the actual goal. So I'm worried that the current, structure of how it's going in Congress will effectively let the U.S., much of the U.S. apparatus, off the hook. In addition, the one very interesting development is that Jeremy Farrar has been named head of, he's to become, I believe in about a month or so, chief scientist of the WHO. Now, Jeremy Farrar is kind of like a cross between, Bill Gates and Tony Fauci. He was head of the Wellcome Trust, which is sort of the British equivalent of the Gates Foundation. It's a nonprofit, but derived its fortune from a pharmaceutical giant, and focuses on those issues as the Gates Foundation largely does. He signed the Lancet letter along with Daszak. And he also, like Fauci, played a behind-the-scenes role in the Nature Medicine article. There were these two pillars of propaganda to dismiss the possibility of lab origin at the beginning of the pandemic. The Lancet letter, which said we did condemn these conspiracy theories that it, might have come out of a lab, and the other was the Nature Medicine article, which said COVID was clearly not a laboratory construct, for it to be a more scientific article. And it was criticized at the time of saying that it proved something when it didn't actually prove it. And it was criticized by Meryl Nass, who's a very independent-minded doctor, and Richard E. Bright, who's the foremost expert on biosafety issues. So he and Fauci basically got that article into Nature Medicine.
Wow.
They didn't sign it. It was all behind the scenes, and this has all come out because of FOIAs from U.S. Right to Know, a transparency group, doing FOIAs and getting a lot of stuff that's redacted, but enough stuff to know that they played a major behind the scenes role in getting those things. And Fauci would he would get a question at a White House news briefing and then use the Nature Medicine article to talk about how it couldn't have come out of a lab. The very same article that he got published, he flipped and, cited as the reason why it couldn't have happened. So Farrar played a major role in, I think he's basically the only person explicitly to sign the Lancet letter and play a role in the Nature Medicine article. Those were the two pillars of propaganda, and the guy who played a role in those two pillars of propaganda is said to be the chief scientist of the WHO. It's a completely absurd situation, and it's pretty much, to me, is as bad as Daszak being put in charge of finding out COVID origins. It's like any other scientist would be good.
Better. Right.
Now, the other, I approached the whole question differently than a lot of other people. A lot of other people, went through the blow by blow of evidence coming out regarding the origins of Wuhan. And I've tried to keep up with that, and I've done some writing on that. But what I did that few other people did was to say, let's build on what I know. I don't know for certain that COVID came out of a lab, but I do know that there is a massive false propaganda effort to say that it didn't. So who's lying and why are they lying?
Okay.
So I examined the authors, the people who signed their names on that Nature Medicine article, that second pillar that I talked about. the first and last authors are the most important in scientific journals. And the first and last authors of that article were Robert Geary of Tulane and Christian Anderson of Scripps Research.
Hmm.
They are both the president and vice president of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium is an umbrella group that contains those two organizations as well as others, including Metabiota, who people might have heard of,
Yep.
and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Africans in 2014 accused these labs of being the origin of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, which people might recall. And they were dismissed as crazy, stupid Africans who were latching onto a conspiracy theory.
Mm-hmm.
I found a substantial case that, in fact, they were right. I found two African authors who wrote books, not saying, we know that it came out of a lab, but really scrutinizing the dominant narrative in very substantial ways. And I built on their work, and I connected with a virologist, Jonathan Latham of the Bioscience Resource Project. And we wrote a very in-depth 12,000 word piece, which laid out the case for the problems of the dominant narrative. For example, Fabian Linders, head of a German team, who also was on the WHO committee with Peter Daszak. It really is, like you said, it's just a few little clique of people.
Yep.
Claimed that the outbreak started because a boy in an African village was playing with bats.
Right.
They claimed that the boy was 2 years old. He was actually 18 months, probably too young to be playing with bats. They didn't find any Ebola in any of the bats in this village. They pointed to a burnt out tree that allegedly had bats in it as the source. The boy and his mother died, but the father, the main caretaker, didn't, nor did any of the healthcare workers in the village. The father and the healthcare workers, think that the boy died of malaria. In past Ebola outbreaks, there would be a die-off of local mammalian species. There was no such die-off, as the Fabian Linders team acknowledged. In addition, so this outbreak happened in West Africa, which is more than 1,000 miles away from past Ebola outbreaks. Furthermore, so I had the crux of this information, and I was about to publish it, and I showed it to Jonathan, and he, substantially improved it, went through all the scientific articles, and he also said, well, hold on, they did a phylogenetic analysis, and this phylogenetic analysis indicates that it actually started in Guinea. The whole point of this is that this African village, Miliandu, is just over the border in Guinea, whereas the U.S. labs are in Sierra Leone.
Right.
So there seemed to have been an effort to frame Guinea.
Wow.
And Jonathan said, well, we got to look at this phylogenetic analysis. So he went through it, and he found problems with it. It was not rooted as a phylogenetic analysis should be in time and place. They did it in a non-standard way, which may facilitate obscuring the underlying data. Some of the people involved in the labs were involved with the phylogenetic analysis. In addition, the big name on the phylogenetic analysis was Eric Lander, who is head of the Broad Institute, is also a partner of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium, and people might recognize his name. He was Biden's principal scientific advisor until about a year ago, where he was forced to resign, allegedly for abusing his staff. Another thread of this is that Ron Klein,
Plain.
who's stepping down now as Biden's chief of staff, some would say prime minister, was named Ebola czar on October 17th, 2014 by Obama. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is that people might have heard that there was a pause in funding of gain-of-function dangerous lab work by the Obama administration.
Right.
That was the same day. The same day that Ron Klein becomes Ebola czar is the same day that the Obama administration says we're cutting off all funding to gain-of-function lab work. That implies, it doesn't prove, but it implies that the Obama administration themselves suspected that gain-of-function lab work was the reason for the Ebola outbreak. So there are a couple of other threads, but those are the main threads that, you know, both in terms of the narrative and in what's wrong with the narrative and the connections between the two outbreaks. So I summarized this on my webpage, and again, a very in-depth piece that Jonathan Latham and I wrote on that. And it really highlights that you have to see this potentially not as a mistake, but as a structure. And as a structure that we have to get at, or else this sort of Damocles will come back to bite us. It might not be for a month, a year, or 10 years, but you know, if we're right about, and it happened with Ebola, and we're not, you know, if it did indeed happen with Ebola in 2014, and then with COVID in 2019, then, you know, this is a very, very serious existential threat. And it's been totally minimized in part because of the funding things. You know, people like Jon Stewart, when he ranted and raved about this, again, that was cathartic. That was cathartic. But he effectively painted science as the enemy. And to me, science isn't the enemy. Science is is like journalism. It's like using reason and observing the world to get at the truth. It's not science. It's a perversion of science. It's science that is being militarized and corporatized in terms of its funding patterns to get scientists to do work that they would not ordinarily do because of the political economy behind it. So that all of that needs to be examined, the dangerousness of the work and the political economy behind it, and the fact that there's no money on the other side. The groups that would have scrutinized this have all tanked. There was a group called the Council for Responsible Genetics. They died because of lack of funding. There was another group, the Sunlight Foundation. They died because of lack of funding. So there's no pushback. So all you have is groups like the Organic Consumers Association, which, you know, mostly fights against GMOs and stuff like that. And they've stepped up and they're trying to do something, but they're very small and they don't, you know, they don't have a staff of scientists like the, you know, like the Council for Responsible Genetics. So there are real structural problems with all of this.
So that's the most explosive news story of our time, really. I mean, it's bigger than Seymour Hersh, you know, exposing the Nord Stream sabotage. I mean, this is just this story connecting Ebola and the framing of Guinea and exploiting Africans. And oh boy, this is something else. So now the political economy, you said, of all this is what? So what's driving all this? What's the motivation? Profits or the American empire? I mean, because was what was happening in Sierra Leone, was that gain of function research for bioweapon purposes?
Yeah, well, Chernobyl is one of my sources. he wrote a book on the subject. He's now, you might want to consider having him on, actually. He's a
Okay.
grad student now at Northwestern. He's doing great work exposing corruption in Sierra Leone. Committee to Protect Journalists just put out a statement defending him because he's getting death threats from Sierra Leone for his more recent work. He talks about, he interestingly enough traces things back to the 9/11 and the anthrax attacks as well,
Wow.
and that the U.S. Juiced up funding for this dangerous lab work at the time, and Lassa fever is endemic to that region, another viral hemorrhagic fever, related to Ebola but different. And it got classified as a class A pathogen that is a concern for so-called biodefense. So he regards that move as having laid the groundwork for this, and that it does, it's money because there's a lot of money in it, but it's, there's money in part because it dovetails with empire.
Right. With the foreign policy objectives of the United States.
Correct, both globally and locally to the regions. I mean, he talks about, and I can't address this, about how the outbreak, affected local politics in ways that were very, that might have been useful to the U.S. So, another thread of this is Metabiota, which has played a role in the Ukraine labs, which I haven't dug into.
Yeah. I've actually looked into them a little bit. They just got sold, I believe.
Yes, they did.
Right.
And they're tied to high tech. And what I'd love for you to fill me in on. I feel bad that I haven't done more on Ukraine on this.
No, I tried to figure out who they were sold to. I mean, it's a Sierra Leone. They were sold to a Sierra Leone company, I believe.
Really? Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Or they were sold from a Sierra Leone. They started in Sierra Leone. Maybe they were sold. Damn, I don't know. But I was trying to figure out if it was a CIA front that was buying them. I don't know.
They have some tie-in with Google.
Right.
And possibly with In-Q-Tel.
Yes, that's what it was. Which is the CIA. That's the CIA's front finance company, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But their role in this was to undercount.
Oh, and then Hunter Biden. And then they're the ones, Metabiota, right, is the ones who worked with Hunter Biden in Ukraine. And there's this letter between Hunter Biden and Metabiota talking about bringing Western civilization to Ukraine and then challenging Russia. Like, it's very clear. This is before the invasion, by the way. Like, it was very clear that what Hunter Biden was doing over there was attempting to do regime change against Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's what it ultimately was. This is all connected. And this is all connected. The Ukraine war, Hunter Biden, the Ebola outbreak, and COVID.
Yeah. It's, the cluster is kind of remarkable.
I mean, everyone needs to be doing this, and everyone needs to be talking about this.
I sort of didn't focus on the Hunter Biden thing because I just assumed that people on the right would pick up on it, and they haven't yet. And I guess I got to do it myself.
Not that piece of it. They care about him being a lackey for the CCP. That's all.
Correct. Yeah. So, I just stuck to getting the story on West Africa as best as I could because nobody else was going to do it. And the Metabiota piece of that was that they were undercounting cases in Sierra Leone. And when Doctors Without Borders finally got there, they were like, what the hell is going on here? And they referred to a hidden epidemic in Sierra Leone. Doctors Without Borders did.
Oh.
And they, it was largely accounted for bungling, that these guys are complete incompetents.
Right.
But there's another reason why they might have undercounted in Sierra Leone. Part of the effort to frame Guinea, they undercounted the cases in Sierra Leone where the US labs were, in order to pretend that the outbreak started in Guinea, blame this the most innocent possible person on the planet is, is a toddler in an African village. Let's pin it on this kid who's playing with bats, allegedly. He's responsible for this, not our multi-million-dollar labs where we're tinkering with these things. So that's,
Is there any journalist besides you who's done anything on this?
I mean, Meryl Nass has done some stuff on this, but she's a doctor and she's got a Substack now. Francis Boyle has been screaming about this.
Okay.
Although he didn't know, I don't know if he knew about the connections with COVID. And as I say, these two African journalists, Chernoba and Constantine Nana,
Okay.
and I assume that other Africans. I mean, I actually did a show in Sierra Leone. They picked up on it, this big thing that's on WhatsApp, and the host was very interested in what I had to say, but he was like, most of the audience figures it came out of a lab.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like it's not used in Sierra Leone. They're like, yeah, of course.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna do more on this. Absolutely. So you and I will talk. I know, really, I think you and I should join forces and organize something here.
Okay, that sounds great.
Get some journalists. You and I know journalists who would be interested in this, and I think we can make some way on this. Yeah. So we have to go. But wow, I'm kind of reeling from this. This was really something else, and your work is stunning. And God, thank you for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Thad.
Yeah. We will be in touch very soon, Sam.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.